The widow flattened the money with both hands. $1,140. Not a check, not a loan. Every bill she had saved in coffee tins, flour sacks, and the hollow drawer of her kitchen table. The auction clerk looked at the cash, then looked at the land description, and his face changed. "Mrs. Pike," he said quietly, "that basin hasn't raised a crop since my father was young." Behind her, someone laughed. Not loudly at first. Just enough for everyone in the room to hear it. The parcel was called the White Field, because in July the surface shone like spilled flour. A dead, crusted 11 acres at the bottom of the county. Too bitter for wheat, too dry for hay, too poor even for grazing, and 71-year-old Eleanor Pike had just bought it with the last money she owned. By supper, the whole town knew. By morning, they had decided grief had done what drought could not. It had finally broken her. Eleanor lived 2 miles past the last paved road, in a farmhouse that leaned harder each winter. When the north wind came through the window frames, she stuffed towels along the sills and slept under 3 quilts. The porch steps sagged. The barn roof showed daylight. The kitchen faucet coughed before it ran clear. But she stayed. That house had been her husband's promise. That land had carried her children's footprints. And even after the bank took the south pasture, the combine, the heifers, and the good tractor, Eleanor still woke before dawn because her body had never learned any other prayer. Her neighbors were not cruel people. They were tired people. They had watched 5 bad seasons turn proud farms into auction lots. They had watched corporate signs rise where family names used to hang. They had signed papers they hated signing, then told themselves survival was not the same as surrender. So when Eleanor bought the worst ground in the county, they did not see courage. They saw a woman who had mistaken memory for a plan. Even her nephew drove out that evening and stood by her stove with his cap in his hands. "Aunt Ellie," he said, "you can't keep saving dead things." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened the cupboard, took down a cracked blue saucer, and set it on the table. Inside lay 6 willow seeds, dry as pepper flakes. Her nephew stared at them. Eleanor said, "Your grandfather kept these from the old creek line. There's no creek line out there. There is on paper." After he left, Eleanor climbed into the attic with a kerosene lamp and a cardboard box tied shut with baling twine. Inside were feed receipts, church bulletins, county fair ribbons, and her father's field book from 1948. Most pages were ordinary: rainfall, planting dates, calf weights, fence repairs. Then, near the back, she found a pencil sketch of the valley before the drainage ditch was cut. A narrow line of willows crossed the bottomland and curved directly through the parcel everyone now called the White Field. Beneath the sketch, her father had written one sentence: "Salt on top does not mean death below." Eleanor read it 3 times. Then she saw the mark, a tiny cross beside a vanished windbreak, and beside that, one more note: "Dig where the willows bent north." The next morning she walked the White Field before sunrise. The land looked exactly as the town said it looked. Pale crust, cracked soil, grasshoppers clicking in the weeds along the fence, nothing alive in the center except one stubborn patch of silverweed near an old fence post. But Eleanor did not walk like a buyer admiring property. She walked like a daughter reading handwriting. Step by step, she followed the curve from her father's map. She measured from the section corner. She counted fence posts. She knelt where the silverweed grew and pressed her palm against the ground. It was cooler there. Not wet, not soft, just cooler. For 6 mornings, she dug before the heat came up, 1 shovel width at a time. The work punished her. Her shoulders burned, her knees swelled. The handle opened the skin below her thumb. She wrapped it with a dish towel and kept digging. Trucks slowed on the road. Men leaned out windows. One called, "Looking for gold, Ellie?" She did not answer. On the 7th morning, her shovel struck something flat. The sound was not the dull knock of limestone. It was sharper, hollow. Eleanor brushed away the packed white soil and uncovered the corner of a hand-laid stone trough, buried less than 2 feet beneath the crust. The stones were fitted too neatly to be accidental. Between them, a dark seam of silt ran like a vein. Then water appeared. Not a burst, not a miracle fountain, just one clear bead rising from the seam, trembling in the morning light. Eleanor touched it with one finger. It was cold. By noon, a shallow trickle had spread across the bottom of the trench. By evening, the first neighbor had stopped laughing. A retired well driller named Ben Larkin climbed the fence with a mason jar. He filled it, held it to the sun, and said nothing for almost a minute. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Don't let anyone cover this back up." That sentence traveled faster than the gossip had. 2 days later, the county extension office sent a soil specialist. 3 days after that, a hydrology professor from the state university arrived in dusty boots and a pressed shirt that did not survive the first hour. They expected seepage from a broken tile line. They expected contamination. They expected a mistake. Instead, their instruments found an old perched aquifer trapped above a clay shelf, fed by runoff from limestone ridges half a mile west. Decades earlier, a drainage project had shifted the surface water away and buried the shallow channel beneath compacted alkali soil. Modern surveys had marked the basin dead because every test stopped at the crust. Eleanor's father had known the water was deeper, not because he owned better equipment, because he had watched willows bend toward it. The first official report was cautious. It said the basin contained a recoverable seep, with unusually balanced calcium, magnesium, and trace minerals. It said the upper soil was damaged but not ruined. It said controlled flushing, cover crops, and careful grading might restore sections of the field over time. That was enough. Because for the first time in 40 years, the white field was not described as worthless. It was described as unfinished. Eleanor did not become famous overnight. The hard part came after the discovery. The same people who mocked her now wanted advice. The bank wanted to revisit her loan file. A land company sent a polite letter using words like partnership, extraction, and exclusive rights. Eleanor read the letter at her kitchen table. Then she folded it once and laid it under the cracked blue saucer with the willow seeds. She had not bought that field to sell the truth out from under it. So she asked for help, but she refused to hand over control. The university mapped the seep. The county helped fence the channel. Local farmers donated old pipe, straw bales, and weekends they could barely spare. Eleanor planted rye first, not for harvest, but to hold the soil while the salts moved down. Then clover. Then strips of native grass along the restored water line. The field did not turn green all at once. It changed in arguments. One strip of earth darkened after rain. Another refused everything. A test plot failed. A shallow furrow held. The first willows were no higher than broom handles, and half of them died by August. But the living half kept leaves after every other weed had burned brown. That was the proof Eleanor trusted. Not headlines, leaves. The reporters came when the photographs became impossible to ignore. A white basin crossed by green. Children from the school walked the fence with notebooks. Graduate students knelt in the dirt where farmers had once refused to park. Men who had laughed from truck windows now stood quietly while Eleanor explained the map, the seeds, and the line in her father's book. One reporter asked her why she risked everything on a sentence written by a dead man. Eleanor looked across the field. The willows were bending north again. "My father didn't leave me a treasure map," she said. "He left me a warning not to confuse silence with emptiness." Those words reached farther than the field ever did. The county built a small conservation project around the seep. Neighboring farmers began testing old low spots before writing them off. The university used the white field as a case study in how local memory, patient observation, and modern science could correct one another, and Eleanor kept working. She repaired the porch one board at a time, paid off the feed bill, replaced the kitchen faucet, not with sudden wealth, but with fair leases, modest grants, and a harvest that returned slowly enough to make every green row feel earned. 5 years after the auction, the field produced its first clean hay cutting, not the biggest in the county, not even close, but enough bales to stack under the barn roof that no longer showed daylight. For Eleanor, that was abundance. People still visited the white field. Some came for the science, some came for the story. But the ones who understood it best always stood near the willow line and went quiet, because the field had not been saved by luck. And it had not been saved by stubbornness alone. It was saved because one woman believed the ground might remember what everyone else had forgotten. The white field did not become valuable when people finally noticed it. It had been carrying its value in silence the whole time. And sometimes, the difference between wasted land and living ground is one person willing to dig beneath the name everyone else gave it.